Hanarithrum, the millionaire CEO signed his own death sentence. But when a young doctor defied every rule, what happened next shocked everyone. The private clinic's corridors were immaculate, the kind of place where the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and money. In one of the corner rooms, behind a door marked with a golden plaque, Ethan Blake lay propped up against sterile white pillows. He was 30 years old, yet the weight of illness had carved shadows beneath his brown eyes and stolen the vitality from his once powerful frame. His dark hair clung damp to his forehead, his skin pale and drawn. The monitors by his bed pulsed with steady, indifferent beeps, a reminder that time still moved forward even when he wished it wouldn't. He had been the kind of man newspapers loved to write about, a millionaire CEO, a self-made visionary whose bold decisions had turned an idea into a sprawling corporation. Photographs of him at charity galas, standing tall in tailored suits, his confident smile lighting up the frame, had decorated the business pages. But here, stripped of the armor of power and wealth, he was simply a man caught between despair and exhaustion. The world outside believed he was indestructible. Inside these walls, he had already signed his own verdict. "I don't want it," he muttered when a nurse adjusted the IV line and mentioned the treatment schedule. His voice was hoarse, his words clipped with finality. "No more. I've made my decision." The staff exchanged uneasy glances. His medical file listed an aggressive but treatable illness. Treatment would be long, painful, uncertain, but not impossible. Yet Ethan had refused every option. His signature sat at the bottom of the refusal form, a single stroke of the pen that weighed heavier than any contract he had ever signed as a businessman. "Mr. Blake, please," one of the nurses whispered, but he shook his head. "Number, I built an empire with my choices. I'll face my death with the same resolve. Better on my terms than dragged through months of agony." His tone was firm, but beneath it lay something else, a hollow emptiness that betrayed the loneliness of a man who believed he had nothing left to fight for. When the door closed and the staff moved away, silence wrapped around him again. He stared out the wide window at the city lights flickering in the distance, their glow muted by glass. That skyline had once been his battlefield, each shining tower a victory, each deal a trophy. Now it mocked him, glimmering with life while he lay tethered to machines, too tired to care. In the stillness, Ethan felt the bitterness rising like bile. What good had his millions done? He had lost friends to betrayal, family to distance, and himself to ambition. When the diagnosis came, he thought money would buy him salvation. Instead, it offered him hollow options that promised only suffering. Refusing treatment wasn't cowardice, he told himself. It was the only power left to him. Hours stretched into days, his body weakening, his spirit retreating. Doctors came and went, their clinical optimism bouncing off the walls of his resolve. He listened without really hearing. He had built his life on control, and in refusing, he clung to the last shred of it. But fate had its own plans. On the third evening of his refusal, the door opened quietly, and a new figure stepped inside. She was young, her blonde hair tied back neatly, her blue eyes calm but keen. Her white coat seemed almost too large for her slender frame, but her presence carried an unexpected weight. She paused by the foot of his bed, studying him not with pity but with something sharper: determination. Ethan shifted slightly, irritation flickering across his face. "Another doctor with another speech?" he muttered. The woman didn't answer right away. She set down his chart, pulled a chair beside his bed, and finally met his eyes. "I'm Dr. Olivia Hayes," she said evenly, "and I'm not here to give you speeches. I'm here to understand why a 30-year-old man is ready to sign away his life when he still has a chance." For the first time in weeks, Ethan blinked, momentarily unsettled. Most people spoke to him in reverence, in fear, or in resigned compliance. This young woman spoke as though he were simply a patient, a man, not a title. He let out a weak laugh, bitter and hollow. "You think you'll be the one to change my mind? You're wasting your time." Her gaze didn't falter. "Maybe, but as long as you're still breathing, I won't let you give up that easily." And in that small room, under the hum of machines and the shadow of his refusal, something shifted. Ethan had expected another lecture, another polite retreat when he dismissed it. Instead, he found a doctor who didn't flinch at his defiance, who looked straight through the walls he had built. He didn't know it yet, but this was the moment his carefully chosen ending began to unravel. The second night of her shift found Olivia standing in the doorway of Ethan Blake's room, the dim glow from the corridor spilling across the floor before she closed the door softly behind her. The machines hummed, a steady pulse that measured the moments slipping past, and Ethan lay half-turned toward the window, the shadows of the city skyline reflected in his tired brown eyes. He didn't look up when she entered. It was as though he had learned to detach himself from the presence of others, nurses, doctors, visitors. None of them mattered to him anymore. Olivia pulled a chair beside his bed again, her notepad balanced on her knees, though she hadn't written a single word yet. She studied him in silence, watching the way his jaw tightened when he sensed her eyes on him. Finally, he exhaled sharply, his voice rough. "You're persistent, Dr. Hayes. Don't you have other patients who actually want saving?" Olivia leaned back slightly, not offended but intrigued. Wanting to be saved and needing to be saved aren't always the same thing. You may not want this, Mr. Blake, but you certainly need it. At last he turned his gaze toward her, irritation sparking in his expression. "You think you know me because you've read a file? That file tells you about my illness, but it doesn't tell you the truth." "And what's the truth?" she asked evenly. "That I don't care." His tone was final, as if that ended the discussion. "I've spent my life fighting. Deals, competitors, deadlines, lawsuits. I clawed my way to the top. And for what? To sit here, surrounded by machines that promise me a few more months of misery? No, thank you. I'm not interested in buying time. Time is worthless when it's empty." Olivia studied him quietly, her pen rolling between her fingers. She had heard refusals before. She had sat with patients too tired, too broken to try again. But this man's defiance was different. It wasn't just despair, it was pride. He wasn't surrendering because he was weak. He was refusing because he wanted control. He had lived his entire life as a man who dictated the rules, and now, stripped of everything else, he wanted to dictate how it ended. "You speak like someone who's already buried himself," she said softly, "but you're still here, still breathing, still watching the city lights." She gestured to the window. "If you truly didn't care, you wouldn't even bother opening your eyes." His brow furrowed, and for a moment his composure cracked. But then he gave a hollow laugh. "You've got nerve, I'll give you that. Most people tiptoe around me. They say, 'Yes, Mr. Blake,' or 'Of course, Mr. Blake.' They don't challenge me." "Maybe that's why they failed to change your mind," she countered. A silence stretched between them, filled only by the rhythmic beeping of the monitor. Olivia could feel the weight of his stare, a mixture of annoyance and reluctant curiosity. He wasn't used to people like her. "I'm not your project," Ethan finally muttered, his voice lower, as if he were speaking more to himself than to her. "And I'm not some tragic story you can fix." Olivia shook her head. "I don't see you as a project. I see you as a man who's convinced himself that dying is easier than living, and I can't accept that without a fight." His eyes darkened, but beneath the hardness, something flickered, something he quickly tried to bury. "You'll lose that fight," he said. "Maybe," she admitted, standing to adjust the IV as if to prove she wasn't afraid of his words. "But I'd rather lose fighting for you than sit by and watch you lose yourself without even trying." Ethan closed his eyes, shutting her out, his face set like stone. But Olivia knew that her words had landed. She could see it in the subtle tightening of his hand against the sheet, in the way his breathing hitched before steadying again. When she finally left the room, she paused just outside the door, her heart racing. She had crossed a line with him, spoken with a bluntness most doctors would avoid. But something inside told her that he needed someone willing to push, someone who refused to let him vanish quietly into the dark. Inside, Ethan lay in silence, replaying her words against his will. He hated that her voice echoed in his mind, hated that she had forced him to feel something other than resignation. But most of all, he hated that for the first time in weeks, he wasn't entirely certain that he wanted to die. The next morning began with a storm rolling across the city, rain streaking down the tall clinic windows like threads of silver. Inside his room, Ethan sat propped up against the headboard, staring at the water's descent as if it were mocking him. He hadn't slept much. Olivia's words from the night before lingered like an echo he couldn't silence. He had always been good at shutting people out, cutting off their voices, dismissing their opinions, but hers clung to him, stubborn, insistent. When she entered, her blonde hair tied neatly back and her white coat crisp despite the long hours, he immediately looked away. He hated the way her presence disrupted the fragile wall of indifference he'd built. She carried a clipboard, but her eyes went to him first, sharp and steady. "Good morning," she said, her voice even but firm. "How are you feeling?" "Alive, unfortunately," he muttered, his tone edged with sarcasm. Olivia ignored the barb, pulling the chair close and sitting down. She checked the monitor, noted his vitals, and then looked back at him. "You're stable for now. That gives us options." "I told you, I don't want options." His voice rose slightly, harder now. "Why can't you accept that?" "Because your refusal isn't strength, Ethan. It's surrender dressed up as control," she replied without hesitation. His eyes snapped to hers, anger flashing in them. "You don't know anything about control. You don't know what it's like to fight every day of your life, to claw your way to the top only to realize it was all for nothing. I built something people said was impossible. I bled for it, sacrificed everything, family, friends, time. And now when the only thing left is pain, I get to decide how it ends. That's the only control I have left, and you want to steal it from me." The words poured out sharper than he intended, but Olivia didn't flinch. She let the silence stretch for a beat, then leaned forward slightly. "You think refusing treatment is control? Number, it's you letting this disease dictate the ending. Real control is choosing to fight, even when it terrifies you. Real control is deciding your life is worth more than the easy way out." His jaw tightened. "You don't understand," he whispered, quieter now, though still defiant. "When you've lived at the top, when you've had everything people dream about, and you realize it's hollow, you stop seeing the point in fighting to stay. Money, power, achievements, they mean nothing when the nights are empty and there's no one to care if you're gone." Olivia studied him closely, her eyes softening at the cracks forming in his armor. Beneath the arrogance, the sharp words, she could see it. Loneliness, gnawing and relentless. She wondered when it had begun for him, at what point success had turned to isolation. "Then let me ask you this," she said gently. "If all of that means nothing, why are you still here? Why are you still signing documents, refusing treatment, instead of just closing your eyes and letting go? Something in you hasn't given up yet, Ethan, or you wouldn't still be arguing with me." He looked away sharply, staring at the rain. Her words dug deep, striking the very place he tried hardest to bury. The truth was, he didn't know why he kept opening his eyes every morning. Maybe it was habit, maybe it was cowardice, or maybe, though he wouldn't admit it, some part of him wanted to be proven wrong. Frustrated, he snapped, "Why do you even care? I'm just another patient to you. Another name on your rounds." Olivia's reply was immediate, unwavering. "Number, you're a 30-year-old man who still has a chance, and I refuse to let that chance be wasted because you're afraid of fighting alone." The last words hit him harder than he expected. Fighting alone. That was what he had been doing all his life. And though he kept his face turned toward the window, he couldn't stop the flicker of recognition that ran through him. Olivia stood, placing the clipboard back on the counter. "I'll be back this evening. Maybe you'll still refuse. Maybe you won't. But either way, I'll be here." When the door closed behind her, Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His hands clenched against the sheets, his thoughts a tangle of defiance and doubt. He told himself she was wrong, that he had chosen his path, but the truth was gnawing at him, undeniable. For the first time since the diagnosis, someone had managed to make him wonder if he truly wanted to die. The rain outside slowed, the storm easing into a quiet drizzle. And in the stillness, Ethan realized that Olivia Hayes was not going to disappear, not like everyone else had. She was going to keep pushing. And whether he admitted it or not, part of him wanted her to. That night, the clinic was quieter than usual, the storm having cleared to leave the city wrapped in a humid stillness. The hallways were lit only by the sterile fluorescence that never dimmed, and most of the staff moved in practiced silence, their steps echoing softly against the polished floor. Olivia moved quickly from room to room, checking charts and patients, but her mind kept drifting back to Ethan. His words from the morning clung to her like a shadow, his defiance, his bitterness, his insistence that there was nothing worth fighting for. She hated to admit it, but beneath his refusal, she had glimpsed something raw and unfinished, something that made her believe he wasn't as ready to die as he claimed. When she pushed open the door to his room around midnight, She immediately sensed something was wrong. Ethan was not sitting stoically upright this time, nor staring out the window with detached calm. He was sprawled against the pillows, his skin damp with sweat, his breathing ragged and shallow. The monitors beeped a warning rhythm, lines dipping erratically across the screen. Olivia's heart jumped into her throat. She rushed to his side, fingers pressing against his wrist to check his pulse. It was weak, thready. His fever had spiked sharply, his body trembling under the sheet. For a moment she froze, knowing exactly what this meant. Without immediate intervention, his condition could spiral beyond recovery. Yet she also knew the hospital's policy. Ethan had signed a refusal form. He had legally denied treatment, and unless he gave consent, they were bound to honor his decision. Her stomach twisted. He had made his choice, but she could see the way his body still clung to life, fighting against his own will. His lips moved, murmuring something incoherent, and she leaned closer, hearing fragments of words, half memories, half pleas. He wasn't gone yet, and if she walked away, if she obeyed protocol, she knew she would regret it for the rest of her life. Olivia's mind raced. She thought of her career, the years of training, the fragile line of rules that kept her licensed. To act without consent was professional suicide. But to stand back and let him die, it felt like something worse. A betrayal not only of her oath, but of the belief that people deserved a chance even when they were too broken to ask for it themselves. Her hands moved almost before her brain caught up. She silenced the monitor's alarm to avoid drawing attention and quickly drew up a line of medication from the emergency cart she had wheeled in under the pretense of routine checks. Her fingers shook slightly as she inserted the IV, whispering, softly as if her words could anchor him. "Stay with me, Ethan. You don't get to go like this. Not while I'm here." The minutes stretched painfully. His fever raged, sweat soaking the sheets, his breathing hitching in uneven bursts. Olivia sat at his side the entire time, swapping cold compresses across his forehead, her eyes flicking constantly between the monitor and his face. She felt the enormity of what she was doing, each second an act of defiance against the system that demanded she obey paperwork rather than her instincts. At one point, his hand jerked weakly, grasping at the sheet, and she took it into her own without hesitation. His grip was surprisingly strong for someone so weak, and his eyes flickered open for the briefest moment. They were hazy, unfocused, but he seemed to see her, to recognize the figure bent over him. "You, why?" he rasped, the word barely audible. "Because I believe you're worth saving," she whispered back. "Even if you don't." His eyes closed again, but his hand tightened around hers before finally relaxing. Hours dragged by before his fever began to ease. The harsh beeps of the monitor steadied, his breathing grew less erratic, and the flush in his cheeks began to fade. Relief washed through Olivia so strongly she nearly sagged against the bed. But she held herself together, wiping his brow one last time before sitting back in the chair. In the dim light of the room, she studied his face, no longer twisted in pain but softened by exhaustion. He looked younger in that moment, less like the hardened millionaire CEO the world saw, and more like a man who had carried too much for too long. She wondered who he was before the empire, before the pressure and the loneliness. Who had he been when he still believed in something? The door creaked open slightly and a nurse peeked in. Olivia straightened instantly, her voice calm and controlled. "He's stable. Just needed monitoring. I'll stay with him." The nurse nodded and left, unaware of the storm that had just taken place in that room. Olivia sank back down, her hand brushing against Ethan's once more, almost unconsciously. "You can hate me for this tomorrow," she murmured, "but at least you'll have a tomorrow to hate me in." She stayed by his side until dawn, her eyes never leaving him. And though she told herself it was duty, some part of her knew it had already become more than that. The first rays of dawn filtered weakly through the blinds, painting the room in soft stripes of pale gold. Olivia sat in the chair by Ethan's bed, her body stiff from hours of vigilance, her mind still replaying the night's chaos like a reel she couldn't stop. Her heart had hammered in her chest as she worked against the clock and against the rules. And now that his breathing was steady and his fever had broken, she felt the bone-deep fatigue settling in. She wanted to close her eyes just for a moment, but she forced herself to stay alert. She knew when he woke, there would be questions, anger, perhaps even fury. And yet, beneath her exhaustion, there was no regret. Ethan stirred with a faint groan, his lashes fluttering against pale cheeks. His chest rose and fell with a steadier rhythm now, his body no longer trembling with fever. Slowly his eyes opened, the brown irises hazy with confusion at first before sharpening on the figure seated at his side. For a long moment he said nothing, just stared at her, as if trying to piece together the fragments of what had happened. "You stayed," he said finally, his voice still raw but stronger than she had expected. Olivia exhaled softly. "Of course I did. You weren't stable. I couldn't leave." His gaze flicked toward the IV line, and then back to her, the realization dawning on him. His jaw clenched, and when he spoke again, his tone carried both incredulity and simmering anger. "You went against me. I said no treatment. I signed the forms. And you did it anyway." She didn't flinch. She met his glare with steady eyes, her voice calm though her heart pounded. "Yes, I did. Because last night you weren't a CEO. You weren't a millionaire. You were a man slipping away while I sat here with the power to act. And I chose not to let you die." His breathing quickened, his hands curling slightly against the sheets. "Do you have any idea what you've risked? Your license, your career, your entire future could be ruined because of this." "I know," she replied quietly, and the honesty in her tone made his anger falter. "I weighed the risk, Ethan, and I'd do it again, because some things are worth more than a spotless record. You may think your life isn't worth saving, but I do, and I refuse to let paperwork write your ending." Silence fell between them, heavy but not empty. Ethan turned his head toward the window, as though searching for an escape from the intensity of her words. The city beyond was waking, its towers catching the early light, oblivious to the battle raging inside this room. He wanted to cling to his fury, to the sense of control that had defined him. Yet he couldn't shake the memory of her hand gripping his through the fever, her voice steady as he drifted on the edge of oblivion. Finally, his voice broke the quiet, softer this time, stripped of its armor. "Why? Why would you risk everything for me? You don't know me. You've seen the headlines, the reputation. I'm not a good man, Olivia. I'm stubborn, selfish, and I've wasted more than most people ever dream of having. So why?" She leaned closer, her eyes unwavering. "Because beneath all of that, I see someone who isn't done yet. Someone who pretends he wants to die because living terrifies him more. And maybe I'm a fool for believing that. But I'd rather be a fool who fights for you than a bystander who lets you disappear." Ethan swallowed hard, the words lodging in his throat. He had faced competitors, investors, ruthless rivals, and never once felt disarmed. Yet here he was, undone by a young doctor who refused to let him surrender. For the first time since his diagnosis, doubt crept into the certainty of his resignation. He closed his eyes, not in dismissal but in retreat, as if trying to hide from the conflict surging inside him. Olivia stayed quiet, letting the silence settle. She didn't need to win the argument today. The fact that he was still here, still listening, was enough. When she finally rose to leave and let him rest, she paused at the door, her voice soft but firm. "You can hate me for what I did, Ethan, but you can't deny it. You're still alive, and that means you still have a choice." Long after she was gone, Ethan stared at the ceiling, her words echoing like a challenge he couldn't escape. For the first time, the idea of living didn't feel entirely impossible. The clinic had settled into its usual rhythm by the time Olivia returned for her evening rounds. The halls smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee, the steady background hum of machines merging with the muffled conversations of nurses. But when she pushed open Ethan's door, she found him sitting upright, a blanket draped over his lap, his face turned toward the window. He wasn't watching the city this time. His gaze was distant, unfocused, as if he were staring into a memory that had returned uninvited. He didn't speak when she entered. For a moment, Olivia wondered if he would shut her out again, retreat behind that wall of arrogance and bitterness. But something in his posture was different. He looked less like a man issuing defiance and more like someone carrying a weight too heavy to conceal. "I used to come home at 2 in the morning, he said suddenly, his voice low, roughened by something heavier than illness. "Everyone thought being CEO meant luxury, but it wasn't cars or penthouses. It was exhaustion. It was signing documents until my hands cramped, negotiating until my voice went hoarse. I'd come home and the apartment would be dark. No one waiting, no laughter, no warmth, just silence. Every night. Olivia set her clipboard down and eased into the chair beside his bed. She didn't interrupt. She could feel it. This was not a confession he gave easily. My father used to tell me, Ethan continued, eyes still fixed beyond the glass, that if you wanted to matter, you had to build something so big it couldn't be ignored. So I did. I built. I sacrificed. Every relationship I had, every friend, every woman who thought she might love me, I pushed them all aside because the empire had to come first. I thought that when I reached the top, I'd finally feel enough. He let out a bitter laugh. But standing at the top is just standing alone, only higher up. Olivia's chest tightened. She had suspected loneliness haunted him, but hearing it spoken aloud stripped away the image of a cold millionaire and replaced it with something far more human, a man who had bartered away pieces of himself until nothing was left but shadows. And then came the diagnosis, Ethan said. His fingers twisted the edge of the blanket, knuckles pale. Stage 2. Treatable, they said. Manageable if I followed through. But all I could think was, what's the point? What's the point of enduring the pain? The poison in my veins, if the life waiting for me at the end is the same emptiness I've already been drowning in? His voice cracked slightly, the first sign of the emotion he had buried under anger and bravado. Olivia reached out, resting her hand lightly over his. He didn't pull away, though his fingers tensed beneath hers. The point, she said softly, is that you don't know what waits for you on the other side. Maybe it's not emptiness anymore. Maybe it's something different, something you haven't let yourself believe you deserve. He turned then, his brown eyes locking onto hers. There was no arrogance in them now, no sharp defiance, only weariness and a flicker of something fragile. Something almost like hope, but too small to name. You talk like there's more for me than boardrooms and contracts, he murmured. Because there can be, she replied, her tone steady but warm. If you choose it. Healing isn't just surviving the illness, Ethan. It's learning that your life has meaning beyond the walls you built around yourself. For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Then Ethan looked down at their joined hands, his voice quieter still. When you sat here that night, when the fever nearly took me, I heard you. I don't remember everything, but I remember your voice. You told me I wasn't alone, and for the first time in years I believed it, even if only for a second. Olivia's throat tightened, but she managed a faint smile. That wasn't just for a second. It's still true. You're not alone, Ethan. Not anymore. Something shifted in his expression then, a small surrender, not to death, but to the possibility of life. It wasn't acceptance yet, not fully, but it was the first crack in the wall he had built around his despair. He let out a shaky breath, leaning back against the pillows. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to stop fighting against everyone, including myself. You don't have to know, Olivia said gently. You just have to let someone stand beside you while you figure it out. The weight in the room eased, just slightly, as if the darkness that had suffocated him for weeks had lifted enough to let in a sliver of light. Olivia stayed by his side, not as a doctor demanding compliance, but as a presence who refused to let him sink back into silence. That night, long after she left, Ethan lay awake replaying her words. For the first time since his diagnosis, he did not think only of endings. He wondered almost fearfully about beginnings. The next week passed in a blur of cautious decisions and tentative steps forward. For the first time since his diagnosis, Ethan didn't slam the door shut when the doctor spoke of treatment. He listened. His agreement came reluctantly, his signature scrawled onto the forms with the hesitation of a man who still wasn't sure he wanted to be saved. But Olivia saw it for what it was, a crack in the armor, a willingness to let life in even if only halfway. That single choice changed everything. The treatments began on a gray Tuesday morning. The sterile room filled with the low hiss of machines and the quiet shuffle of nurses preparing the IV. Ethan sat rigid in the chair, his jaw clenched, his dark hair falling slightly into his eyes. He didn't look at the line being connected to his vein. He looked instead at the floor, as if bracing for battle. Olivia stood close, her presence steady, her voice calm as she explained each step. Not as a doctor ticking boxes, but as a companion walking beside him into the storm. When the first wave of nausea hit, he bent forward, gripping the armrest until his knuckles turned white. Sweat broke across his forehead, and for a moment he looked like he might tear the IV from his arm and storm out. But Olivia knelt beside him, her hand closing over his, her voice low and firm. Breathe through it, Ethan. Don't fight the feeling. Let it pass. You're stronger than this moment. His eyes met hers, burning with pain and fury, but something in her tone anchored him. He forced a ragged breath in, then another. The storm didn't vanish, but he weathered it. The days that followed were brutal. The therapy drained him, left him pale and hollow-eyed. His once imposing presence reduced to fragile vulnerability. More than once he cursed the decision, muttering that death would have been easier, cleaner. But every time, Olivia was there. She adjusted pillows, checked monitors, whispered encouragement when he thought he had none left to hear. Sometimes she said nothing at all, only sat in silence, her quiet presence stronger than any speech. One night, long after visiting hours had ended, she found him awake, staring at the ceiling with eyes shadowed by exhaustion. She pulled a chair to his bedside, her own body aching from too many shifts, but she refused to leave. He turned his head slightly, his voice low. Why do you keep coming back? You've done your duty. You've risked enough. Why stay? She hesitated, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. Because I believe you can make it through this. And because I don't think anyone should have to face this alone. His gaze lingered on her, studying her as though he were searching for the catch, the hidden agenda. But all he found was sincerity, and it unsettled him more than he cared to show. He looked away, his voice rough. You make it sound so simple. It isn't, Olivia admitted. But sometimes the hardest fights are the ones worth taking on. As the treatment cycles continued, Ethan began to change in small, almost imperceptible ways. The bitterness in his words softened. The silence he once used to shut out the world became something quieter, more contemplative. He began asking questions, not about business or contracts, but about life outside the walls he had built. He asked Olivia about her family, her dreams, the reasons she had chosen medicine. She answered honestly, surprised at how natural it felt to share pieces of herself with him. There were still nights when he broke down, when the pain clawed too deeply and he demanded to quit. On one of those nights, when he nearly ripped the IV from his arm, Olivia caught his wrist, her eyes fierce. No, Ethan, not tonight. You've come too far. Don't undo what we fought for. Something in her tone, desperation, determination, maybe even affection, stopped him. He slumped back, his chest heaving, and whispered, You say we like this is your fight too. It is, she said simply, because I refuse to let you fight it alone. For a long moment, they stared at each other in the dim light, the air heavy with things neither dared to name. He finally looked away, but not before she saw it, the flicker of trust breaking through the fear. By the end of the second week, his body was battered but alive, his spirit bent but not broken. He no longer spoke only of endings. When Olivia caught him watching the sunrise one morning, she asked what he was thinking. He answered after a long pause, his voice quiet, almost disbelieving. That maybe, just maybe, there's still something waiting for me on the other side of this. And for Olivia, that was enough. Because beneath the exhaustion, the nausea, the fragile steps forward, she knew the real transformation had begun, not just in his body, but in his will to live. Summer sunlight poured into the clinic garden, painting the world in shades of green and gold. It had been weeks since Ethan's treatment began. Weeks of pain, fatigue, small victories, and crushing setbacks. But now, sitting outside for the first time in months, he felt something stirring in him that he had long buried. Life. The air tasted different. Every breath hurt less than the last. And for once, the weight pressing on his chest wasn't despair, but the fragile realization that he was still here. Olivia walked beside him, her blonde hair pulled back loosely, her white coat abandoned in favor of a light sweater. She had insisted he get fresh air, and though he had grumbled at first, secretly he was grateful. The benches were scattered with patients and families, children running across the lawn, laughter spilling through the warm air. It was a scene he had never noticed before, not in his years of chasing deals from one skyscraper to another. He had built an empire, but he had missed this, life in its most ordinary, unpolished form. You're quiet, Olivia said, watching him carefully as they found a shaded bench. He lowered himself down, his movements still deliberate, his strength not yet fully restored. I'm thinking, he admitted. About what? About how close I came to never seeing this again. His gaze followed a child tumbling in the grass, shrieking with laughter. He let out a slow breath. If you hadn't, he broke off, his voice catching. His eyes flicked to hers. If you hadn't done what you did that night, I wouldn't be here. Olivia shook her head softly. You don't owe me anything, Ethan. You made the choice to keep going. I just stood beside you when you couldn't stand for yourself. But Ethan's expression was firm, almost fierce. No, Olivia. You risked everything. Your career, your future. You saw something in me I didn't even see in myself. I thought money was the only thing that proved I mattered. You proved me wrong. You showed me that being alive, simply being alive, is worth fighting for. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Olivia looked away, her throat tight, unwilling to let him see how deeply his confession struck her. She had fought for many patients, but this was different. With Ethan, the lines between duty and something more had blurred until she could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. Ethan leaned back against the bench, closing his eyes briefly as the sunlight brushed across his face. When he opened them again, his voice was softer, almost uncertain. Do you ever wonder if things happen for a reason? That maybe all of this, the illness, the fight, you being here, it wasn't just chance? Olivia hesitated, then answered truthfully. I don't know if I believe in fate, but I do believe in choices. And I think the choices we've made brought us here, right now. That has to mean something. He studied her for a long moment, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt the raw urge to believe in something beyond profit margins and boardroom wars. He felt the urge to believe in her. As the weeks stretched into months, Ethan's body grew stronger. The treatments took their toll, but his resilience deepened. And with each passing day, his relationship with Olivia shifted subtly, growing roots in the unlikeliest of soil. She became not just the doctor who defied protocol, but the woman who sat with him in silence when words failed, who pushed him when he wanted to give up, who saw the man beneath the titles and scars. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the horizon in orange and rose, Ethan found himself standing with her in the garden again. His steps were steadier now, his frame less fragile, but his heart was unsteady in a different way. He turned to her, his voice carrying a vulnerability he rarely allowed. When I signed those forms refusing treatment, I thought I was writing my ending. But you, he paused, his gaze unwavering. You gave me back more than my life. You gave me a reason to live it. I don't want to waste that second chance. Not on boardrooms, not on chasing emptiness. I want to build something real, something that matters. And I don't want to do it alone. Olivia's breath caught, her chest tightening with a mixture of fear and something warmer, deeper. Ethan, she began, but he stepped closer, his voice trembling but resolute. I don't know what the future looks like. I don't know how long this remission will last, or what battles are still waiting for me. But I know one thing with absolute certainty. I want you to be part of it, if you'll let me. The silence between them was electric, filled with everything they hadn't said but had felt for weeks. Olivia's eyes softened, her lips curving into the faintest smile. You're a difficult man, Ethan Blake. Stubborn, infuriating. But you're also worth the fight. And yes, I'll stand with you. He let out a breath, almost a laugh, relief flooding his features. For the first time, the man who had once chosen death over uncertainty was choosing life, not just for himself, but for them both. As the evening deepened and the first stars blinked into the sky, they sat side by side, a fragile but undeniable beginning taking root between them. The world outside still saw Ethan Blake as the millionaire CEO who had nearly thrown his life away. But Olivia knew the truth. He was simply a man who had found a second chance, and in doing so, had found her. And in that garden, beneath the soft glow of twilight, the ending Ethan had once signed for himself was replaced with something far more powerful, a beginning. What strikes me most about Ethan and Olivia's journey is how the story isn't really about illness or even about wealth. It's about surrender and defiance in the face of despair. Ethan, a man who had everything the world celebrates, discovered that none of it gave him the will to live. Olivia, with nothing but conviction and compassion, risked everything to show him that life is not measured in contracts or profits, but in connections, in moments of courage, in choosing to keep fighting even when the outcome is uncertain. For me, the power of this ending lies in transformation. Ethan's second chance isn't just medical, it's emotional, even spiritual. He doesn't walk away merely as a survivor. He walks away as someone who has learned that love, hope, and vulnerability are stronger than control or pride. Olivia, too, is transformed. Not just the doctor who saved a life, but the woman who dared to see the humanity behind the patient and in doing so, became part of his rebirth. The shock in this story is not the miracle of medicine alone, but the miracle of two people colliding at the edge of death and discovering that life, fragile, uncertain, imperfect, is still worth everything. To me, that's the true heartbeat of the story. Not survival for its own sake, but survival that opens the door to love, meaning, and beginnings neither of them believed possible.